U.S. President Joe Biden heads to Warsaw this week. It's his second trip to Poland in less than a year. That really speaks to how important Poland has become as Western allies forcefully respond to the war. Here's the FT's diplomatic correspondent, Henry Foy.
Poland's been the fulcrum, if you like, of both military support for Ukraine. The vast majority of Western weapons that have been supplied to Ukraine have gone through into Poland first, been collected there, and then shipped across the Polish border. But also diplomatically, Poland has been the sort of diplomatic heart of the push to make Europe take this more seriously. The push to make sure that support for Ukraine is sustained financially, humanitarian, and militarily. And also that sanctions pressure continues on Russia. So if America, if you like, is the engine of the Western response, Poland is really the voice of it. It's the megaphone, making sure that NATO and EU partners remain as supportive as possible to Kyiv.
Henry, the FT just spoke with Poland's President Andrzej Duda, and in his interview, he urged NATO members to provide Ukraine with post-war security guarantees. Why is he asking this?
I mean, of course, the wider context of this is that Poland has now, for years and years, well in advance of Russia's war, said Russia is a threat to Eastern European countries. We need more security guarantees. We need more military deployment in Eastern Europe. What Duda's saying in this interview with the FT is that big countries in NATO, and really he's talking about the UK, the US, and France, the nuclear-armed members of NATO, need to give Ukraine bilateral security guarantees so that Russia knows, even if Ukraine isn't in NATO or the EU anytime soon, it can't do this again.
And what kind of response might he get? Will NATO say, sure, we're going to do this, or no?
None of the big Western countries are showing their hand. It's obviously a very, very sensitive issue. Nobody wants to go to war with Russia. There's obviously going to be no security guarantees offered while this conflict is raging. But it does speak to a much bigger issue, which is what is the European security architecture going to look like when this war ends? What is Ukraine's role in that going to be, and what can the West do to support Ukraine going forward? The question of how we prevent this happening again is really at the heart of the post-war debate.
Henry Foy is the FT's European diplomatic correspondent. Thanks, Henry.
Thank you very much.
Tomorrow, we'll talk more with Henry about how the war has upended Europe's approach to Russia. For now, we'll turn to the FT's Felicia Schwartz for the U.S. response.
The U.S. position is they'll support Ukraine as long as it takes. It's become really one of the, if not the primary focus of American foreign policy. It really is an existential threat to the rules-based international order, which sounds like a very wonky term, but is really kind of the rules of the road that the West, led by the U.S., established after World War II. And they see making sure that Russia doesn't, get away with invading its neighbor as a pretty important goal to uphold the world as it stands with the U.S. As kind of the leading power.
Felicia, it seems like there's this push and pull of U.S. support. Ukraine asks for a certain type of weapon, whether it be a tank or an aircraft. And then the U.S. and other Western countries hesitate, but then they end up sending it. What's your take on this?
I guess I would say on the one hand, the battlefield and the conditions on the battlefield and what the Ukrainians need has changed over time. And I think also another part is that all along the Americans have been really, conscious of escalation. President Biden made it very clear to his national security team, number one goal of the U.S. is not to get into direct conflict with Russia, or for, NATO not to get into direct conflict with Russia. So I think they're kind of constantly calibrating all the time. I did a piece about some of this, and one of the things I heard from the analysts I spoke to is that whether it's by design or by accident, the assistance kind of ratchets up little by little, and it kind of creates like an information environment or a situation where it's not some dramatic escalation. It's like little by little, the U.S. is doing more, and it's not like there's some significant moment where there's some, intense change or system that Russia feels like it has to react to.
Felicia Schwartz is the FT's U.S. Foreign Affairs and Defense correspondent. Western military strategists have, for decades, focused on terrorism as the key threat. Now, with Russia and Ukraine, we've got ground battles between two sovereign armies, harkening back to wars from last century. We've been tracking this land war with the FT's defense and security correspondent, John Paul Rathbone. He's with us again today. Hi, JP.
Hi, Mark.
So, JP, where are we today? Who has the advantage in the war?
Essentially, you've got a stalemate on the front line, which is not to say it's not moving. It sort of moves one way, a few kilometers one day, and then moves a few kilometers back another day, and there's fighting all along. The challenge for either side is how to break this gridlock, essentially. And on the one hand, Russia has still got mass. It's called up 300,000 reservists, so they're being thrown into the fight, and it still has an advantage of artillery and armor. And on the other hand, you've got the Ukrainians who have quality instead of quantity, and that's a lot to do with the will to resist by its troops and their level of motivation, and of course the Western supplies of ammunition and other weapons. So it's almost like before one of those American football games where both sides are glowering at each other and they're sort of scrunching against each other at the moment.
JP, you've been covering this war since the start. Over the past year, what would you say is the most surprising development?
I think what has taken a lot of people by surprise is the state of the Russian army and the realization that it was a Potemkin army in many senses. It looked great on the outside, fantastic on parades, less good in action. And they've had a lot of trouble in coordinating between the various arms of the army, and it's been much less effective than people thought. That's not to say that you should underestimate the Russian army. It's sort of like this Tyrannosaurus Rex. It may not have a big brain. Again, don't underestimate the Russians in that aspect either. But basically, it's just this huge, gnashing beast, extremely dangerous, and you've got to treat it with extreme caution.
So does that mean Russia could win this war at some point?
I don't think you can say that Russia will ever win this war. I mean, strategically, it's lost. That's not quite the same, though, as saying that Ukraine has won. But the question is, what does the nature of Ukrainian victory come to look like? In some senses, the mere fact that the Kyiv administration is still there, the country is still there, it's still fighting, that is a success compared to where we were exactly a year ago, where many people expected Kyiv to fall. But between surviving and actually winning and pushing the Russians out of the country, that's a big gap.
JP, I know you do not have a crystal ball. None of us do. But what's next for the war?
What does peace look like is, I think, the question you're asking. And what would make that peace lasting? And if the Russians remain on Ukrainian territory, and let's include the Crimea in that as well, you can imagine a frozen conflict akin to the Korean Peninsula. But that doesn't mean hostilities will cease. There'll still be the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. Russia could still lob missiles into Ukraine. So is that a lasting peace? I don't think so. And Ukraine would also continue to want to be pushing the Russians back. What happens if the Russians get pushed back all the way to Ukraine's borders, as established in the United Nations in 1991? That's a clearer line. And Ukraine would sort of reinforce those borders with Western help. And then Russia would be behind those borders, licking its wounds. But when I say that Russia has lost, it's lost strategically in the sense that it hasn't conquered Kyiv. NATO is more united than ever. The West has shown remarkable coherence and cohesion in helping Ukraine. But that's not to say that Ukraine has won. What does victory look like to Ukraine? It's the million-dollar question, and a lot will depend on what happens on the battlefield over this coming year.
JP Rathbone is the FT's defense and security correspondent.
President Joe Biden is set to travel to Poland to meet with allies to reassure them of the U.S. commitment to the region as Russia's deadly invasion of Ukraine reaches the one-year mark. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby says the United States is committed to standing by Ukraine.
We know the next weeks and months are going to be difficult and critical, especially for their armed forces, and the United States is going to continue to stand by them.
Highlighting his support for Ukraine, President Biden invited, for the second year in a row, Ukraine's ambassador to the United States as one of his special guests to his recent State of the Union address. Describing Russia's invasion as a test for the world, in that speech, Mr. Biden pledged the United States would stand with Ukraine.
Putin's invasion has been a test for the ages, a test for America, a test for the world.
Mr. Biden underscored his commitment to Ukraine for both international and domestic audiences, but it's a commitment that's testing the patience of a narrowly divided Congress over both the high costs of aiding Ukraine and the reverberations of the conflict on the global economy. Fiona Hill, a former official with the National Security Council and now a senior fellow with the Washington think tank, the Brookings Institute, says there is still a lot of popular American support for Ukraine. But she wonders whether the Republicans will continue to support Ukraine.
Will all of the Republicans in Congress, for example, with the shift in the House, continue to support? There's questions about blank checks to Ukraine and whether American taxpayer money should be trying to support the Ukrainians in their ability to fight off the Russians. But there's still, quite a lot of popular support.
A year ago, Russia massed troops in preparation to invade Ukraine. Many in the West, and even in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, doubted President Vladimir Putin would follow through on those intentions.
So many assumptions that we've had about this conflict, about ourselves, about Russia, about the Russians have been challenged.
12 months later, Kyiv still stands, and Ukraine has surprised even its own expectations, buoyed by a U.S.-led alliance that's equipped its forces with tanks and advanced air defense systems. Delivery of that equipment will have a big impact on the shape of the conflict, believes retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindeman. Mr. Vindeman, a former National Security Council director, believes that if the aid arrives on time, the Ukrainians will be able to hold off a Russian offensive.
2023 is now, based on how these timelines for delivery of tanks and other equipment, is likely to play out with the Russians conducting an offensive over the course of the next several months, throwing pretty much everything that they have. The Ukrainians weathering that.
This comes as NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says there are no risk-free options with the level of involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Some worry that our support to Ukraine risks triggering escalation. Let me be clear. There are no risk-free options. But the biggest risk of all is if Putin wins. If Putin wins in Ukraine, the message to him and other authoritarian leaders will be that they can use force to get what they want. This will make the world more dangerous and us more vulnerable.
Mr. Stoltenberg was speaking at a panel discussion at the Munich Security Conference in Germany. During the panel, Finnish President Sauli Niinistö stressed once again that his country wants to join NATO at the same time as Sweden, but that this decision was now in the hands of Turkey.
Little by little, they have increased in expressing that they might ratify Finland and just Finland. And even we have heard some voices that if Finland is willing to this kind of separation. And our answer is very clear. We have expressed our will together with Sweden, and we don't react at all. We will not accept or demand any kind of separation.
Meanwhile, Estonia's prime minister insisted that once the war in Ukraine ends, Russia must be brought to justice for war crimes, as well as the decision to invade its neighbor in order to have any chance of developing a normal relationship with the West. Kaja Kallas, whose small Baltic country is the biggest per capita contributor of military aid to Ukraine, says the conflict cannot end with a peace deal that carves up the country and doesn't hold Moscow to account.
What we have to do is to completely discredit aggression, that aggression can't have, benefits for you. It has to be with higher price so that, all the aggressors or would-be aggressors in the world would make the calculation and it doesn't pay off. As long as it pays off like this, let's have a peace agreement now when you have moved and taken more territories than the side of Austria and all the countries, smaller countries combined together, then, why not to do it again?
Her comments came a day after U.S. President Kamala Harris said the United States has determined that Russia has committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine and needs to be held accountable.
The United States has formally determined that Russia has committed crimes against humanity. And I say to all those who have perpetrated these crimes and to their superiors who are complicit in these crimes, you will be held to account. In the face of these indisputable facts, to all of us here in Munich, let us renew our commitment to accountability. Let us renew our commitment to the rule of law.
Assam Al-Ghalib, SBS News.
The U.S. Secretary of State has told China's foreign minister that a Chinese spy balloon must never again violate U.S. airspace. Antony Blinken met Wang Yi in Munich a few weeks after U.S. fighter jets shot the balloon down. Beijing says it was a weather balloon that blew off course.
There was no apology, but what I can also tell you is this was an opportunity to speak very clearly and very directly about the fact that China sent a surveillance balloon over our territory, violating our sovereignty, violating international law. And I told him quite simply that that was unacceptable and can never happen again. We're, of course, not the only ones on the receiving end of these surveillance balloons. More than 40 countries have had these balloons fly over them in recent years, and that's been exposed to the world.
Emergency crews are still finding earthquake survivors in Turkey. A couple with their child were rescued in Hatay on Saturday, 13 days after the earthquakes. The victims were trapped under the rubble for 296 hours. The child later died in hospital. And in Syria, a baby girl born just after the first earthquake struck is to live with her aunt and uncle. She was found alive last week with her umbilical cord still connected to her dead mother, who apparently gave birth while she was buried under the rubble of a 5-story building in the rebel-held town of Jindaris. The sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has warned the U.S. to stop what she calls all acts threatening Pyongyang's security. The comments come just hours after North Korea said it had tested an intercontinental ballistic missile. Japan's defense ministry says the missile landed about 200 kilometers off the northern island of Oshima, inside what Japan calls its exclusive economic zone. A missile has struck a building in central Damascus. Local reports say it was fired by Israeli forces. The building that was hit is said to be near a large security complex and close to Iranian installations. Several people have been injured. Protests have been held against Israel's coalition government for a 7th week. Tens of thousands of people have been gathering in Tel Aviv to demonstrate against proposals by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to change the judicial system.